Hello, this video lesson will go over poverty. Let's define poverty. Poverty can be defined as a condition of deprivation due to economic circumstances. Poverty is severe enough that the individual in this particular condition cannot live with dignity in his or her society. The U.S. government defines what is considered official poverty, and according to their specific definition of poverty, 1 in 6 people in the United States lives in poverty. In addition to this, 5% of people are living in near poverty. So about 20% of our entire population in the U.S., that's 1 in 5 people, are near poverty. Let's look at a few more definitions of poverty. We can conceptualize poverty in terms of relative poverty, and relative poverty is based on a percentage of the median income in a given location. So you might say that if you make, let's say, 20% less than the median income, you are relatively poor compared to the rest of the country. Relative poverty is particular to whatever location it is that you're looking at. You would compare yourselves to people around you. Absolute poverty is a universal approach to poverty. Absolute poverty is a point in poverty at which you cannot afford to support basic human needs such as shelter, clothes, and food. We can think of absolute poverty as the point at which household income falls below the necessary level to purchase these basic human needs. Let's take a look at the poverty threshold. The poverty threshold for a family of 4 is $23,550 and $19,534 a family of 3. Basically, we don't think that in the United States anyone who makes more than $23,000 deserves to get any help. We think that they're well off and fine on their own. So one thing about this measure is that it's based on a really old methodology that was developed in the 1960s, but is now recognized as pretty outdated. Things have gotten way more expensive, and we are spending a lot more, and our wages are fairly stagnant, meaning they're not going up. So although we're spending more, we're not getting paid more overall as on average in our society. So a lot of people argue that this poverty threshold is extremely low, that it should really go higher because $23,550 is not enough for a family of 4 to try to survive. So current research suggests that a family of 4 would need about twice as much as what the U.S. government says you would need to survive. And this is just accounting for basic needs, things like food, medical care, child care, shelter, meaning rent or mortgage, and clothes, and all of the basic necessities that people need to survive and live with dignity in our society. The poverty threshold doesn't account for the cost of living in different areas. So if you want to ask for assistance in LA, it's the same income threshold that they're applying to someone who lives in a small town in Kansas. This means that even though where you live might be expensive to live, the same income requirements apply to you regardless of where you live. Improved measures are needed to better identify struggling families. A lot of families are falling in between the gaps, meaning that they don't make enough money to survive on their own, but they're also not getting any help. So let's talk about families who fall into deep poverty. So these are individuals that are well below the threshold. In America, we have 7% of people that make less than half of the poverty threshold. So that's what's considered deep poverty, is making less than half of the poverty threshold, which is already extremely low. So for instance, for a family of 4, deep poverty means making $12,000 a year or less. And again, this is almost 1 in 10 of our entire population who lives with this particular income. Deep poverty is a serious issue because those who end up in deep poverty are very unlikely to ever escape poverty. A lot of people who live in poverty are often in and out of poverty. Sometimes some years they will be okay, other years they won't be okay. And a lot of people float right above the poverty line as well. And the difference with people in deep poverty, though, is that they are very unlikely to ever escape this. And one of the reasons why is we have very few support systems for people with disabilities, people who become ill or become disabled because of their something that happened at their work or some type of injury. We have very little support system for them, and it's a lot of these individuals that end up in deep poverty, having to pay medical bills, having no income to support themselves. And so another thing that ends up happening is if these individuals have children, their children also end up in deep poverty by default. So out of everybody who lives in deep poverty, 35%, over a third of them are children, individuals 16 years of age or younger. And again, these are people who aren't able to work because they've been disabled or injured in some way, and their kids end up suffering as well. And we tend to blame people who end up in poverty, but of all people in the country, children really shouldn't be blamed for their impoverished situation, especially if they're under the age of 16, because technically they can't even work. So the bigger picture of poverty is that a lot of these people are not really at fault for their impoverished position. And in fact, a lot of people who are poor are working. And they even have a name for these individuals. We call them the working poor. However, because quote unquote welfare, which it really isn't, gets so much negativity, many people are not aware of the working poor. What most Americans don't know is that most people that live in poverty actually work at least part-time, and some people even work full-time and are still considered living in poverty or near poverty. So let's take a look at those statistics. You can see here over to the right, a lot of people work at least full-time, at least part-time jobs. 46% at least work part-time. What's astonishing is that 33%, a third of people who live in poverty, work full-time jobs. That means they work 40 hours or 35 hours a week or more and are still unable to make enough money to be considered not officially poor, which is pretty astonishing because usually people think, if I work a full-time job, I should be okay. But unfortunately, that's not the case. If you look at the other figures, only 28% of people are eligible for work but are not employed. A huge segment of the poor are kids, and so 26% are unable to work. They're ineligible to work because of being children or being in school. Other people are disabled, like I mentioned before. And also other people are retired. So that segment of the population is ineligible for work. Okay, so what happens to children when they grow up in an impoverished environment? Well, their parents are going through quite a bit of stress, and this also transfers over to the children. There's something called poverty-induced stress that can lead to a host of issues. Lack of concentration at school, which could lead to getting in trouble at school, for anything from getting detention to getting suspended or expelled, and overall just getting a bad label attached to you and not being able to be put on the fast track for college, or not being able to get the support that you need because you get a bad label attached to you. People who are in impoverished situations often have to move around a lot. So it's difficult for a child to get settled into a school when they have to move from one place to the next. Children in impoverished situations also have higher emotional and behavioral problems. And when you live in unsafe neighborhoods, this could lead to victimization, crime victimization, or early entry into the juvenile criminal justice system. Poverty is also a racial issue. Whites are less poor than blacks, Hispanics, and even Asians. So clearly there is some type of systemic discrimination going on in the United States, some type of systemic racism that tends to funnel wealth, power, and prestige to people that are not of color. And we also have an economy, a judicial system that tends to discriminate against African Americans and Hispanics. There are a couple of arguments when it comes to what causes poverty. The culture of poverty argument says that people adopt certain practices because they're poor, and that keeps them poor. So people who are poor have different beliefs and values and behaviors than people from the middle class. And so, although these practices and behaviors are responses to tenuous financial situations, they develop into self defeating practices like applying for welfare or feeling defeated or saying, I'm never going to get out of this situation. So, the culture of poverty argues that it's all in people's behaviors and it's all in people's heads, basically, and it's up to individuals to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and get themselves out of the situation. Structural arguments argue that it's not enough to just look at individual people. You have to also look at the society in which these people are living in. And when you look at the social policies and the economic patterns, we see that there's a huge amount of discrimination going on. There's a huge amount of exclusion going on, and there's no reason why blacks should be more poor than whites. You look at their genetics and they're no different from one another, but yet this is the case. And the structural argument says that it's because of historical practices that have left a legacy into today's world, and our policies today are without malice discriminating against people of color.